Today, expanding the clean energy economy in the Midwest. My guest today is John Delurey of Vote Solar. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Welcome to Solar Works for Illinois. Today we're talking to John Delurey, who is the director of the Midwest for Vote Solar, a national advocacy organization that was established in California but now works nationally. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to dig into what's going on in the Midwest regarding legislation and the clean energy economy. Vote Solar is front and center in that battle, I will call it, because it is a slog and there are opposing forces. We see the scandals unraveling here in Illinois and Ohio, where utilities are trying to game the system in their favor. And so we need action. We need grassroots action, and Vote Solar is a wonderful organization organizing that kind of grassroots action to forward clean energy legislation. So we're going to get into that. But before we do that, John, give our listeners some background on yourself, because you have a very interesting and apropos background for working in the solar industry.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Thanks again for having me. I have had a meandering path to Vote Solar, but it feels like a perfect fit. So I'll share a little bit about myself and then a little bit about Vote Solar to build on Tim's introduction. And then really excited for some of the questions. So I actually launched my career on the off-grid solar space overseas. I was hell-bent to work with countries to leapfrog the fossil-fueled centralized energy grid and to develop a patchwork quilt of microgrids, mini-grids, and off-grid solar home systems in rural areas, primarily in East Africa. So I dove in deep, learned Swahili, learned a little bit of Hindi, and spent about a year and a half over a couple different patches working in East Africa, and in particular Zanzibar, to set up this training facility for women to become solar technicians. And so these women would learn about solar. They would be able to take apart and put back together a charge controller faster than I ever could, and would then go back and electrify their village, jumping straight from kerosene candles to solar systems, 20-watt peak, 3 LED lights, and a cell phone charger. So I did that for a few years. Did a short stint with the World Bank and a slightly longer one with USAID, sort of an offshoot of the State Department focusing on humanitarian aid. Came to realize that work was all for naught if the US continued to be a laggard on climate action and climate change. So did sort of a radical shift in my career, became a community organizer, started working for Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign for a couple years, mostly in Missouri, working largely in rural parts of the state to coordinate co-ops in particular to embrace community solar and to explore solar options and to understand that this transition is inevitable and that their member owners could greatly benefit. So that experience led me to love US solar even more and to become fascinated with the industry. And so when I moved to Chicago, I dove into a solar company and spent a relatively short stint with an amazing Illinois born and raised solar company named Certisun. And when this Vote Solar position crossed my radar, I leapt at the opportunity, especially because of Vote Solar's dedication to improving access and equity within the solar sector. So I'd be happy to give a little bit of background on Vote Solar, but I wanted to see what you thought might be best next, Tim.
Yeah, let's talk a little more about some of your experiences, because those are pretty awesome experiences, both working in Africa and with the Beyond Coal campaign. So what is it like to learn Swahili? I speak Norwegian and English, and it was pretty easy to learn Norwegian. Most people have no idea what an easy language Norwegian is to learn compared to like French, which I banged my head against in high school for 4 years. And then I went and lived in Norway and learned the language, and now I'm fluent, and I have 2 children who are half Norwegian and are living in Norway. But anyway, what's Swahili like to learn?
Swahili is a very different language than anything else I've ever tried. So I studied French in high school and Spanish in college. And so I started to understand the Romance languages and saw how similar they were to English in some ways, still a puzzle in others. Swahili is a different thing altogether. You have 8 words condensed into one, and you have to conjugate every part of it depending on what you're referring to. So you would say, like, I remember you as Nina Kukumbuka, which is like, included in all of that is I will remember you later, essentially. So it becomes a challenge, but just like you mentioned with Norwegian, I lived there. I was fully immersed working in this solar field for this amazing solar NGO, and just sort of had to pick it up because otherwise, frankly, I would go hungry. I was out in the middle of nowhere, and it was just too useful to not learn. And then I also studied it in college and had a fellowship from the feds to learn Swahili. They view it as a critical need language in terms of national security. And so they gave me a generous stipend to go and do this work overseas for a year, which is why I ended up working for the State Department for a short while.
So you did the Africa experience when you were in college?
So I did a study abroad semester, which sort of sparked my interest. But
Yeah.
this longer stint where I was working for Barefoot College, that off-grid solar NGO, was in the tail end of my master's program and beyond. So it was one of my first experiences coming out of grad school. And it was transformational, but also eye-opening in all the ways that important development work is being done by locals and can be done probably better by locals. And that my time was better spent intervening, trying to root out corruption, frankly, back here in the US to try to bring in the clean energy future.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to imagine that there are many, many people, over 1 billion people living without electricity.
Yep.
And we forget that. And it's it's when we do things like we in the pre-show, we were talking about my RV trip to Colorado and Utah. When you're off the grid camping, then you really start to notice and appreciate the value of electricity for simple things like pumping water to your faucet, or giving you light. And so off-grid solar was really where solar got its start, right? That was the main application for it. It was very expensive technology, but it was great for off-grid. And so that was the early adopting community.
That's right. And when you look overseas, they're still building coal plants. We've seen the end of coal's expansion in the US, but they're still popping up in a lot of different places. And those are long-term investments, and they shouldn't exist because there are opportunities to embrace the clean energy future in ways that we, with the existing centralized grid system, can't in the same way. So this vibrant ecosystem of mini grids, microgrids, and large transmission, just to allow for varying degrees of wind and solar, it gives a new opportunity for them to get ahead of us. Some of these countries that are starting from scratch on their grid, it's an opportunity not to be missed. But I, again, felt like there were brilliant people in the government of Tanzania who were ready to take on that challenge. And so I knew it was time to come home and try to get our own house in order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the West, the developed world, needs to be a beacon of light. And because we absolutely have the resources to make the energy transition. And now there's real evidence with things like the 2035 report out of Berkeley that I've talked about on the show that demonstrate lock, stock, and barrel that we can clean the grid. We can do it in the next 15 years. And it's not going to cost consumers any more money. It's going to save us a lot of ill health. It's going to create 500,000 jobs a year. It's just lots and lots of win-win green economics, right? And you see the Biden campaign adopting that platform. So, well, I'd love to do a whole show about off-grid solar in Africa, but Then the coal campaign in Missouri. What was the reception that you got from rural co-ops? I'm curious. How's that going?
Yeah, so hostile would be, if I had to sum it up in a single word. I'm sure it's changed a lot since then. This was back in 2014. I I knew that member owners, individual customers of the distribution co-ops, were ready for solar. We're excited about solar. We're eager to have solar. I also knew that some distribution co-ops were providing some misinformation to those customers about the benefits of solar. We had stories of member owners calling their co-op and getting accused of wanting to electrocute their linemen. There was a lot more misinformation back then than there even is now, even though 2014 wasn't that long ago. I feel like we've come a decent ways since then. But the main focus that we took on was to run member owners for the board. Most distribution co-ops have democratically elected boards. And so we found clean energy advocates and ran them and worked the room, went to the annual meeting, watched the bluegrass bands and had a few hot dogs, and then would try to recruit enough votes to bring in a new, more refreshed, more clean energy focused board. And it was challenging. Our win number sort of shifted under us. Suddenly there were 100 more votes cast than we had anticipated. So there was a strong inertial force trying to keep the board intact and trying to keep the co-op doing what they've always done. And so I love rural electric cooperatives. I mean, I love their history. I love the principles that guide them. And I think, especially when it comes to energy efficiency and demand response and a few other really fun tools, they should be the first to adopt them and embrace them. I think they just need that little nudge and some fresh energy to guide them in the right direction.
Yeah. There is an interesting phenomenon in human psychology. We sometimes just cannot see things that are right in front of us because they're outside of our paradigm. And I think that's the case with energy companies, and entities, grid operators, co-ops, utilities, generating asset owners, until they start to grok something, meaning start to really digest the value proposition. It's foreign, and they literally just cannot see it.
That's right.
And we experience that in the Midwest still on many levels, right? Because solar is so new here in the Midwest. Even though ISEA, the Illinois Solar Energy Association, is over 40 years old, so there's been an industry. It started with solar thermal, hot water, and then evolved into PV, and now PV has eclipsed solar thermal because of the economics of PV. But so, well, let's get into Vote Solar. Give us the rundown on what you and Vote Solar are doing.
Sure. So Vote Solar, it's sort of a strange name, right? We don't do electoral politics. So we don't work for a campaign specifically. We're not a PAC. We also are not a solar company. I still get a lot of LinkedIn requests from those looking to help me with my sales pipeline. We don't really have a sales pipeline. We don't manage any projects. We are sort of an independently funded 501c3 nonprofit that is determined to bring about the clean energy future as quickly as possible and as equitably as possible. And the way we do that is at the state level. We are one of the groups that, since our founding, has recognized the need for thought leadership, for community organizing, and for really sound policy at the state level. So we have regional hubs that manage a regional portfolio. We're split into regulatory and campaign staff. So I am on the campaigns team, and that means that I do most of our legislative work. That work focuses in Illinois, in part just being based in Chicago. It might make me a little biased. I also do a fair amount of work in Michigan, which has some exciting opportunities ahead, and slightly less work in Minnesota, but try to keep a finger on the pulse of the greater Midwest region and to support my regulatory counterparts as they do the formal interventions, roaming around, bothering regulators, trying to ensure that we get the best solar-friendly solutions possible. But I think within that, I just want to add additional emphasis to this notion that solar, if not designed and deployed in the right way, actually runs the risk of perpetuating inequity. And I don't say that lightly, but if you look at where solar is going now, and if you look at the current makeup of the solar workforce, it is actually expanding on certain disparities within the country. And these are broader disparities that we've always been mindful of and worried about, but the trend seems to be in such a way that the benefits of solar are primarily going to those who already have a certain amount of wealth and privilege. And we need to make sure that not only is everybody along for the ride, but we're using climate solutions as a way to address broader societal ills. And so we believe that solar can be one of those mechanisms for catalytic growth and justice. So we are not an environmental justice organization, but a lot of our staff are dedicated to environmental justice. And we partner closely with grassroots organizations and environmental justice groups to ensure that we're listening to the communities that are plugged into the ground and that we understand their local needs, and that we are ensuring that these policies are designed so that they do bring about those benefits in the communities that might not naturally receive them just because of some of the fundamentals of solar. So it's a nuanced topic, and I'd love to chat about it more, but it's increasingly part of Vote Solar's purview is to dive into how to make solar more equitable and to ensure inclusive access.
Yes, and this was blatantly obvious when I was out west, because I often will refer people to visit Colorado to see a state where the industry is further along, but it is very spotty. There's a lot of solar in Boulder and Denver, which are quite well off economically. But if you go to rural parts of Colorado, I was in southeast and southwest Colorado, you don't see much solar at all at any scale, residential, commercial, industrial, utility. It's just not happening. Now, there are some big utility scale projects in the Four Corners area that are happening in the longer term, which are wonderful, and have an EJ component because there's a whole history, right, of mining and coal mining, uranium mining, and then coal generation, which pollutes Native American communities and other rural communities in the Four Corners area. This is Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado. Yeah. And, but I was shocked, John, how little solar I saw. And so I come back to the Midwest with a renewed interest in how do we make solar more equitable. It is fundamentally a great technology for leveling the playing field theoretically.
Yeah.
But it is expensive for most consumers to individually go solar or for business owners to go solar. It's an investment. And if you don't have free capital or access to capital, you just don't have access. And that's why things like community solar and the Solar for All program, which is part of FIJA that we have rolling here in Illinois, those programs are wonderful, and we can talk a little more about Solar for All. We also want to talk about the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which Vote Solar is actively working on to expand the RPS in Illinois. we have a 25% RPS in Illinois that says we'll achieve 25% clean power by 2025. Then we got FEJA in 2016, came into force 2017, going to add 2,800 megawatts of solar, 1,000 megawatts of wind, and it was happy days. Then everyone saw how quickly that was like a flash in the pan, and all the commercial industrial recs are now used up. We have a little bit of runway in residential still. Luckily, as we were talking, Solar for All does have consistent funding, although it's a relatively small slice of the pie. What's the landscape from your perspective in Illinois, John?
Yeah, it's sort of a turbulent time in Illinois, and earlier, as you mentioned, in Ohio as well. I first want to lift up the success that we've had through FEJA in building a really vibrant, dynamic solar sector, and in particular to point towards the Solar for All program, which was designed with these concerns in mind, right? That left to its own devices, rooftop solar might go to those who have access to capital and who have discretionary income, or who have a credit score that might help them apply for some sort of third-party private loan, or have a home equity line of credit. There's a lot of ways to go solar, and a lot of those are much more difficult for low-income and EJ communities to tap into. And Solar for All recognizes that, and was created through the FEJA legislation to specifically try to counteract those headwinds that blow against those communities. And so we've seen tremendous uptick in community solar and in some of the larger projects that are for nonprofit and public facilities. We still have some room to improve the residential side of things. I mean, just like you mentioned in Colorado, you drive any north to south road in Chicago, and you'll see plenty of solar up north and a whole lot less down south. And it's just the nature of the beast that study after study has shown that the benefits of solar tend to go towards relatively affluent white communities. And even when you adjust for income and wealth, it still is predominantly in whiter communities. And I think part of that is possibly because the solar workforce is predominantly white. You know, I may get the specific percentages off by a point or two, but the people of color solar workforce is about 9%, whereas in the broader workforce, it's about 14%. So we've seen that in solar, it's actually even less diverse than in the broader workforce. So we've got some work to do, but Solar for All, in all of its glory and in all of its shortcomings, is designed to try to counteract some of that. The other key point that you mentioned is access to financing. And that is one of the things we hope to improve in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So we're starting to toy with the idea of creating a mechanism for inclusive financing that would not only benefit, wealthier homeowners who are interested in going solar, but would provide a lot more options for those who don't have the credit score or don't have the nest egg that they can pour into solar. And what's currently in CEJA is a program called Pay As You Save, or PAYS. And this is a form of on-bill financing. So it would allow a homeowner to get the system installed, to get the money they need from their utility, from their IOU, and to pay that back through their energy bill with a guaranteed savings. So that system would be tied to their meter, not their household. So it opens up, or not their personal credit score or their personal finances. So it allows renters to tap into it in different ways. And it also would ensure that if somebody moves, the person who takes that on just keeps paying it through their energy bill. So there's a bunch of different ways of on-bill financing. Rural Electric Co-ops have led the charge on on-bill financing, but it's a no-brainer for energy efficiency. And it's something we're exploring for solar. And we might be one of the first states that does this type of on-bill financing for solar. And this is part of a much broader package. Clean Energy Jobs Act is about 800 pages or so. And it was written in collaboration with communities, especially EJ and low-income communities, through a series of about 150 or 180, can't remember the specific number, listen, lead, share events where different community organizations went around and they asked citizens, they asked Illinoisans what they wanted to see in their energy future. And what came out once it went through sort of the policy wonk apparatus and legislative thinkers was the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So I would love to go through a few different components very briefly of CEJA, but I'll turn it back to you to see where our time is best spent.
Yeah, let's do that. We don't have a lot of time, so
yeah.
let's get some of the details. We have not talked about CEJA on the show. We have talked more about the path to 100, and just so our listeners know, there was a time when CEJA and the path were on the same path, and then they diverged, and the solar industry basically wanted some things that they didn't see happening in CEJA. They wanted a quicker, shorter term fix to the funding cliff that we have happening with FEJA. And so for anybody who's listened to the show understands that we had generous incentives for commercial industrial solar. Those incentives have now been tapped out for a period of time. We don't know if it's 2021 or 2024, but it could be until 2024 before there will be new REC contracts available to commercial industrial solar owners. So anyway, now there are several energy bills in the Illinois legislature being considered. The path to 100 is one, CEJA is another. There are several others, but let's get into what is CEJA and what is Vote Solar working on with regards to CEJA.
Yeah, so I appreciate some of that background there, and I think both advocates of CEJA and advocates of PATH agree that we need to arrive at an energy bill, and we need to find common ground and common cause to put our energy together towards a bill. We have too many forces that are out there trying to oppose clean energy legislation to have fully divided and let ourselves open to conquering. So I understand that the Path to 100 bill spun out for good reason, and a lot of that was because there were elements that were not considered in CEJA, in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. I believe, since a few listening sessions and from working closely and from analyzing Path to 100, that we now have most of those provisions in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So, those can be relatively small fixes that CEJA may have initially overlooked that now firmly includes, such as increasing the small DG cap from 10 kilowatts to 25 kilowatts. Shouldn't have ever been 10 kilowatts. It's been a pain in the neck for DG and residential companies. But it expands that. It also clarifies some of the interconnection rules. It clarifies this process of transitioning away from net metering towards a DG rebate. It ensures that there isn't a disruption in the sales pipeline for those companies. And it makes some changes to the way that different programs are funded to ensure that we don't see this cliff. Lastly, I'd argue it makes that funding available immediately. Because we're past the cliff. Community solar's cliff was long past. Large DG dried up 7 months ago. And so what's left is small DG, and it's not looking good, as you mentioned. We're worried about solar companies. We're worried about everything that we've built since FEJA, and we're worried about solar workers. The last thing we need during a pandemic is additional forces working against the solar workforce and all these solar companies. So CEJA does all of that while also committing us to 100% renewable energy. So it actually kicks off really quickly to try to not only get us to that 25% by 2025 goal, but to bring us to 46% renewable energy by 2030. So it's explosive growth within, this first decade, assuming we get the darn thing done soon. And it increases as we go. So the rate increase allows for additional funding through the RPS that will accelerate as the bill progresses. So starting in 2023, we'll see more funding than we would see from any other energy bill right now. And the reason why there's that slight delay is the hope and the goal and the intent of the legislation, which we're still hammering out in conjunction with governors, staff, and everybody else who's involved with these working groups that we've seen some press about, to try to figure out how to ensure there are savings from capacity market reform to offset the increase in energy bills. Because the last thing we want to do right now is increase bills for communities and for ratepayers that are already struggling to make ends meet. So we increase the RPS, we offset it with savings, but CEJA does so much more because the community demanded so much more. It has a program for electric vehicles and to ensure that there's a last mile option. It is going to create a new workforce development program that involves about 16 different hubs around the state. So not just in the Chicago metro, as many legislators fear, but 16 hubs around the state that allow for training with actual implementable and transferable skills. It also creates this contractor incubator program to allow additional Illinois entrants into the solar market as it continues to grow. So I would argue that there's so many different pieces of CEJA, but the solar specific RPS pieces are now really well aligned with the solar industry's wants and needs. And I think it just merits a larger, longer conversation to make sure that it does work. Because we, on the CEJA side of things, don't want a bill that isn't going to work for the solar industry. I mean, it's imperative that the solar industry not only survives, but thrives in a post-CEJA world. So I look forward to expanding on that conversation and trying to figure out a way to bridge the gap.
Yeah, and everyone in the Path to 100 camp wants CEJA, and they recognize that we need both. It's a both and so I'm glad to hear that there are some. This is how I see it. CEJA is much bigger and comprehensive. Path to 100 is impactful in some very specific ways, especially when it comes to funding RECs. So for our listeners, it's one thing to have an RPS. An RPS is a goal, okay? We have an RPS of 25% in Illinois. Virginia now has 100% RPS. Wisconsin has 100% RPS. But they have to have a mechanism, right, to incentivize the market to actually make the transition. And in Illinois, that main mechanism is renewable energy credits. So when you turn on a solar system or a wind system, you're generating renewable energy credits. One REC is 1 megawatt hour of electricity from a renewable energy generating facility. And then the program here in Illinois, right, gives that the value of energy from those facilities a perk. It is worth more than just ordinary energy. And so what that does then is it incentivizes owners to get in the game, right? Yep. And it works very well, maybe too well. Sometimes it happens though. So how do we, I love to hear this 46% by 2030. That's wonderful. And that would mean huge growth in the renewables industry here in Illinois. How do you fund, though? What is the funding mechanism to make that happen?
Yeah, it's still REC driven. So CEJA builds on the success of FEJA, and it creates a few different mechanisms for catalyzing solar's growth. So it keeps the ABP, the adjustable block program, and it expands it dramatically. It triples the Solar for All budget, so that it's $50 million per year. But when it comes to actual megawatts and putting megawatts on the board, a lot of that is inevitably going to come from large scale projects. And so just like we do now, there will be competitive procurements for those RECs. We'll also be able to leverage an Illinois specific capacity market to help catalyze large scale solar's growth. So in all the ways that we're now over procuring capacity, and for all the reasons that our current capacity market structure in the PJM market fails us and fails customers, an Illinois specific capacity market will help ensure that not only is the playing field leveled, but we're able to further boost renewables and especially large scale solar. So the percentage wise, to get to that 46%, it does require a lot of bigger projects. But the ABP program, the Solar for All program, they also grow dramatically in CEJA to ensure that we build on this ecosystem of companies and installers and solar workers that we've created over the last few years through FEJA.
So funding RECs in under FEJA, we fund RECs through a small fee on ratepayers' bills. So as a consumer or a business owner in Illinois, if you're in ComEd, Mid-American, or Ameren territory, look at your power bill. You can see there is a fee on there. Sometimes it's referred to as an RPS fee. There's different language, but it's capped at what today, and what happens to that fee moving forward under CEJA?
Yeah, so the fee is increased because we need more funds and we need a larger RPS budget. So currently the cap is 2.66%. I could be off on that, so you may want to fact check me.
2% is the number that I know, but so it's in that 2% zone.
Yeah, well, so maybe what I'm imagining is 2% is the current cap. Under CEJA, the cap increases to 2.67, so it increases a little bit immediately to ensure we do have some new funds. It then increases to 4.88, if I remember correctly. So it actually becomes larger than what's imagined in the Path to 100 Act starting in 2023. And the reason why there's that slight delay is to make room for this capacity market reform and the savings that come from capacity market reform to help offset that additional fee to customers. So it would require diving deeper into capacity market reform, and maybe another guest could take that deeper dive. But the whole goal there is that the RPS is more fully funded, but as much of that funding as possible is coming from capacity market reform, because we're no longer having to over procure capacity through PJM. And if that doesn't happen, it still has that RPS increase. No matter what, the RPS is increased to 4.88 by 2023, the middle of 2023. And so we're preparing to dramatically increase the RPS budget and the rate cap in the full intention that ratepayers won't actually see that increase because they'll have so many bill savings elsewhere through CEJA, if that makes sense.
Does that capacity charge structure, does that relate to MISO as well? Because the state is divided. Northern part of the state is in PJM. The central and southern part of the state, which is a big part of the state, is in MISO. How does MISO get impacted by that?
Yeah, so the savings are designed to help catalyze solar and renewable growth statewide. So the way that we recapture our capacity market is most directly influenced of ComEd. It's the ComEd territory that is in PJM, and it wouldn't affect Ameren. But a lot of the benefits that come out of that are statewide. So it's not like Ameren customers would be paying more than ComEd customers. Their savings would be similar.
Yeah, and so, but unlocking RECs, like we're experiencing a funding cliff right now in commercial industrial solar in Illinois, and it's not that projects aren't getting into the pipeline. They are, and they must, because the only way to get RECs under the adjustable block program is to get your project in the queue in the program. what the program will not be able to tell you when they are going to start issuing new rec contracts. That could be as long a wait as 2024, according to Anthony Starr, who came on the show a couple months ago. But let's say we get CEJA this fall, right? In November, there's a veto session in November. There's a lot going on legislatively, of course, because of the COVID economy that we're trying to recover from. And so there's many fiscal issues that the state is dealing with. But of course, CEJA does represent a potential boon for consumers, for contractors, for people that do training, as you've mentioned. I mean, there's so many parts of the economy that will be stimulated by the expansion of our RPS. And, and we have to recognize that that FEJA is not getting us to 25% by 2025. FEJA is flawed. It was a very worthy effort, and I know it was a long slog in the making, and nothing is perfect. But we now recognize that it is falling quite a bit short of its goals. And so we need more incentives in the market to incentivize people to go solar, whether that's residential, commercial, or industrial / utility, right, across the spectrum. Because that, especially at the higher end, the large DG and up, 25 kW and up, that pipeline is getting very thin right now. Yeah. So what do you say to contractors who are going, well, I'm thinking about moving to Virginia to chase solar work because there's nothing going on in the DG market in the Midwest?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's been crisis after crisis on the Illinois legislative landscape, and
yes, it has.
The divisions between PATH and CEJA are small and relatively insignificant compared to the broader tides that have been fighting against us. So We've seen multiple political scandals, we've seen a pandemic, and we've seen plenty of other smaller forces that have intervened and stopped us from seeing a legislative victory. I mean, we were hoping to have a convening that brought the various parties together, including the utilities and others that had submitted their own energy bills, because there were about 5 or 6 floating around at one point, and get them all to convene and to understand that we need energy legislation now. And I, as someone who worked in the Illinois solar workforce, it keeps me up at night that we're witnessing a slow and steady decline of that industry, and much of that work has already disappeared. Again, I mentioned the cliff is long past in certain sectors, and that pipeline is increasingly thin. And I don't know that legislators feel that urgency. I know that solar companies are contacting state legislators. There are ways of putting this on their radar, but with so many other crises that feel like larger fires to fight, it's been challenging to keep it on the radar. But it's not going to be there unless we put it there. So I think we just need to keep stoking the flames and keep reaching out to legislators and just demand energy bill. Like call it PATH, call it CEJA for right now. We need energy legislation, and we need it in the fall. Absolutely. I mean, without it, we're in a world of hurt.
Yeah, the scandal that you refer to is that Exelon has now settled. They've made an initial settlement and agreed to pay a fine of $200 million, ostensibly for criminal activity involving Illinois state legislators. That is an ongoing investigation, and we're not going to dive too much into that. But the nuts and bolts of it are that the utility industries nationally have a history of fighting renewable energy, and they've been fighting it in Illinois. I think it was a poison pill that we are now experiencing the cliff that we have with FEJA, right? And our legislators need to understand. So I work for a commercial industrial solar installer called Continental Energy Solutions. We are having our all-time greatest year this year. We're installing 30 megawatts of solar, which is eye-popping for us, okay? And that's a wonderful thing. We went from 17 megawatts last year to 30 this year. Next year, without additional legislation, we might fall below last year. We might go to 10 megawatts or something like that, right? There's going to be some bleed over into 2021 from this pulse of work that's getting done right now, building out blocks 1 through 4 worth of RECs worth of solar in Illinois. But after next year, then it's like zero.
Yeah.
You know, so yes, we as a contractor now have no choice, if we want to continue to be a solar installer, to look at other territories. And we are. We're very keen to grow Illinois and do more work in Illinois. We're a 112-year-old Illinois contractor. We're a 4th-generation family business, deeply rooted in Northern Illinois and Chicagoland. And while we are happy to work statewide and install community solar and commercial industrial solar anywhere in Illinois, we have no choice but to explore neighboring states and even further afield opportunities, because that's where the market is. And there are no near neighbors. It's noteworthy that when you look at Vote Solar's website and you look at your campaigns, you've got Minnesota and Illinois and Michigan, but you don't have an Indiana campaign. You don't have an Ohio. You don't have a Missouri. You don't have an Iowa. And what that tells me is that there's a gap, right? There's not comprehensive activity here in the Midwest. There's some shining stars. Minnesota came first. Now we're chasing Minnesota. Michigan could pop, and there is utility scale happening certainly in Indiana and Ohio, and maybe some DG rumblings. I hear occasionally rumblings of commercial industrial opportunities in Ohio. But what I'm aware of is lots and lots of utility scale, both here in Illinois and neighboring states. These are 100 to 300 plus megawatt projects, which are just very hard for contractors like us to grab onto because they're so massive compared to what we normally do. Eventually we will get there, but it's a real problem. And so to our legislators, please understand the Illinois workforce, the contractors working in the solar industry day in and day out, the boots on the ground, we desperately need your support and new legislation. It's not enough to rest on FEJA's laurels. FEJA was wonderful, but it is completely inadequate to maintain a smooth ride of growth. We have a boom and we have a bust. So I'm all about a solution. And I know there is no perfect solution, but we desperately need a solution this fall. Whether, the odds are only 50-50 perhaps that will happen. Pritzker, our governor, who is a Democrat, has made a point, in his State of the State that clean energy is a priority for him. So we'll see. What else can we say though, John, about Illinois and our prospects? If it doesn't happen this year, okay, then we go to the spring session, right, in 2021, and then and we've been hearing this, right? Well, we're on to the next session. And these things take time, and I appreciate that, but the industry will suffer.
Yeah, we need it. We need it in the fall, and we need leadership to guide the way. I mean, we've seen scandal after scandal get in the way of real progress, and so our bill fully intends to include elements of utility accountability to ensure that, for example, the utilities can't intervene at the 11th hour as they did last spring to kill even a small fix that would have bought the industry some time. And that was the rollover fix, or the rollover deadline extension, where there was some additional money that could have been released just almost due to a clerical error. And the utilities didn't have anything else to fight, and so they decided to fight that. And they killed it. And it would have It would have not fixed FIJA or set us on the right path, but it would have bought us some time and it would have given us some breathing room. And so, Siege obviously includes that funding, which would be immediately dispersed and made available through the rollover fix. It's everything we need to build back better from COVID-19. I mean, it involves the clean energy workforce is exactly what we want to see in a recovering economy. And we're letting it die in Illinois. We're willingly and actively, or through our legislative leaders, letting that process come to a complete standstill and to lose all of the gains that we've made over the last few years. So it has to happen. It benefits all of us to be pushing in the same direction, because again, we have more enemies than allies. So I would love to see the forces that are promoting the clean energy future possibly find ways to set aside their differences and to align behind a single legislative opportunity. I think that we're going to need to all be pushing in the same direction to see this happen, especially in light of some of the recent scandals and this sort of long-standing corruption that tends to prevail. This will not be written by the utilities. It will not be in some back room. It needs to be people powered. And a lot of those people need to be in the solar industry and need to be pushing because, the workforce depends upon it.
I mean, the scandals referring to Illinois and Ohio both had similar recent scandals that are tied to utilities that are heavily invested in nuclear. The Future Energy Jobs Act is subsidizing the nuclear industry in Illinois to the tune of $230 million a year to keep 2 nuclear power plants open, Clinton and Quad Cities. Exelon is the owner of those assets, the benefactor of FIJA, and now has admitted, right, that they have been conducting criminal activity. And it's a sign of desperation on their part. That's the good news. Utilities see the writing on the wall that the energy transition is unstoppable for simple economic mathematical reasons, that they're like laws of gravity. And you cannot stop the clean energy transition now. It is the economics are on our side. So, but you can bribe legislators to slow down the transition in certain places, and that is what is going on here in Illinois. They are trying to slow the transition. Yep. Now, and so the worst case scenario is that, we have to go and work in other places, but we'll be back in 2024 whenever that happens, and hopefully it's sooner. We definitely want a smoother transition and a smoother ride, but we will get a Clean Energy Jobs Act, including a path to 100, right? We will get that. It may take longer than we want, but we will get that. There is no doubt in my mind, John. Is there any doubt in your mind?
No, none whatsoever. I mean, it's overwhelmingly popular with the public. We did some recent polling and CEJA and some of the programs therein were overwhelmingly popular. And I suspect that path would be too, if asked around. Solar and wind and clean energy, it is demanded by those when they're not overly focused on their day in, day out livelihood. And I know that's been the priority, since COVID and everything else. But people want it. They know that it's needed. The governor knows that it's needed. It's just a matter of expressing it as the priority that it truly is. So I think we'll see it in the fall. I think we will see key measures of utility accountability woven into that bill, that legislation. I could see ending the formula rate, which has been a tremendous benefit to some of our utilities here in Illinois. I could see some ethics reform to try to prevent this type of corruption from happening in the future. But I also can see trying to ensure that we keep carbon-free resources around while we make this transition to 100% renewable. So it's sort of this delicate balance where we need to be pushing gas and we need to be pushing coal out of the mix. And we need to be aiming towards a climate friendly, fossil fuel free energy future. And we have no time to wait. I mean, energy workforce aside, climate change is intensifying every minute of every day. And our delays are increasingly to our detriment. So we need climate action, and we need something to ensure that the renewable energy workforce can thrive.
Very well said, John. And unfortunately, we're out of time, and I think we're going to leave it there. We will, by the time that this broadcasts, we will also have spoken with Will Kenworthy at Vote Solar, so it'll be a nice 1-2 punch. I really appreciate your time, John, and we're going to have you back on the show because this is a fascinating conversation. We didn't get to enough, but such is life. And so I'd rather leave our listeners a little hungry for the next round, which there will be. And so thank you for your work, and let's grow solar. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Thanks for listening to SolarWorks for Illinois.